but we'll get going. So, welcome to this afternoon session, which is on evidence-based policy on aging, and our speaker, Dr. Alexandre Sidorenko, who I'm going to introduce properly in a few minutes, is here with us, and we're very grateful to Alex for being here, and it's great to have him. So the purpose of today's session was really out of conversations with some of our doctoral researchers as a part of the HOMeAGE network about how to generate impact with respect to policy and the sort of ways in which then we can, if you like, motivate or affect positive change. So there's a whole series of different elements that we need to think about now in that respect, both in terms of the more creative methods, which we'll need to revisit at another stage, but also then just more understanding of the sort of ways in which decision making takes into account various different kinds of evidence. So it's a pleasure to have Alexandra with us today, who is the Senior Advisor at the European Centre for Social Welfare Policy and Research, but has also extensive experience working at that research and policy juncture in a number of different remits and a number of different roles over the years. So this would include acting as a Vice Chair now currently with the HelpAge International Board of Trustees, but also Alex would have served as the Chief of the Population Unit in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, so the UNECE, and head of the United Nations Programme on Aging that was based in New York as well. So a wealth of experience and no doubt a wealth of tortured experience of having to try and deal with these kind of research and policy conversations. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex now. I was going to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion afterwards. So Alexandra, and I think Christine is going to start sharing your slides now, and you can commence whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you for your introduction in the first instance, and much more, of course, for inviting me to take part in this research and practice online training session. That's my first experience of being a part of this exercise. And thank you, of course, to everyone who decided to make this event part of their day. My particular thanks to Christine, who agreed to show my slides or my links, but much more free now. So the subject of my presentation is on the screen. It's evidence-based policy on aging. I do appreciate that it's a bit a deviation, perhaps, from the usual considerations you're giving in your sessions. You, for good reason, are focusing on the content of research. I would like today to speak more about the context in which research is done, and particularly the research which is related to policy development. Next slide, please. As the title of my presentation suggests, there's three key words in my talk. It's policy, evidence, and aging. First, I will answer these seemingly obvious questions. What is policy, and on what is policy is based? I will then review the types of evidence needed for policy making and at various stages of the policy process. The central part of my presentation is, for good reason, I believe, devoted to policy on aging, particularly international policy frameworks on aging, and their relationship with research and information. Finally, I will discuss the experience of aligning research and policy on aging through research agendas, again focusing on the international policy frameworks. Next slide, please. So let's start with the basics. So what is policy? According to the concise Oxford Dictionary, which on the screen, it's, I quote, a course of principle of action adopted to or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. Yes, individuals too, which means that each of us can have our own policy. However, we will focus today on public policy, which concerns us all. Here is the Professor Thomas Dye's definition of public policy, which was made about 30 years ago. I quote, and this is on the screen: "Public policy is whatever governments choose to do or not to do." The keyword in this simple definition is choice. But what determines the choices of governments, and indeed anyone? In other words, what constitutes the basis of a policy? Next slide, please. Evidence is intended to inform the policy, in other words, to form its basis. If an evidence basis is provided, the policy becomes evidence-based or evidence-informed, and these are two a bit different notions. This sounds obvious. However, it is not uncommon for policy to be based on convictions or opinions, thus becoming conviction or opinion-based policy. What are the differences? The three definitions on this slide explain the differences between evidence-based policy, evidence-informed policy, and opinion-based policy. Evidence-based policy, the first block on the left, prioritizes decisions based on objective scientific evidence and rigorous research, rather than ideology, anecdote, or opinion. And in short, evidence-based policy implies that policy should follow the best available evidence. Again, this is obvious. Evidence-informed policy is a little bit different. It integrates high-quality evidence in the first instance, as well as the evidence-based policy, including scientific research and data, into the development and implementation of policies. In short, evidence-informed policy implies also that policies should be guided by evidence, but also shaped by context and capacity. Opinion-based policy is different. In essence, it's not the policy process itself, it's a political practice, which is based on a person's, usually a politician's, fundamental values or ideas, rather than attempting to present or represent an existing consensus based on evidence. An example of conviction-based policy is the belief of several state leaders that the SARS-CoV-2 virus does not exist, which means that no special measures are required to combat the pandemic. And this notion has been revived in recent months, as we all have learned. Next slide, please. If we choose, as I hope, the evidence-based or evidence-informed policies, it will be important to discuss the types of evidence required for them. Next slide, please. At least three types of evidence are essential for developing and implementing any policy, any public policy. Research evidence, in the first instance, which can be defined as any systematic effort to increase the stock of knowledge. That's the definition which was designed by OECD back to 1981. Capacity evidence is equally important. That includes information on the societal capacity to address and complete the policy tasks. More specifically, this includes information on available infrastructure, such as institutions, human resources, and yes, of course, financial resources. The third type of evidence is public and political evidence, which unfortunately is very often taken not into consideration too late or not at all. This comprises information about how the public, politicians, and the media would react to a proposed policy, either helping or hindering the success of the policy. Next slide, please. Policy is not a single act of action or inaction. It is usually a process. While the policy process can be linear, one stage after another, it is ideally cyclic or circular. Why? It starts with agenda setting, marked with a star on the slide, which involves identifying challenges and opportunities and formulating priorities. It follows by the formulation stage, which involves producing goals, objectives, and measures or actions. The next stage is crucial, that's implementation, of course, the central part of any policy process, accompanied by monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation reveal the outputs, outcomes, inputs as well, and gaps of the implementation process. The evaluation findings and recommendations can eventually lead to adjustments to the policy content. As a result, it would close the policy process and turn into a circular cycle. Next slide, please. Every stage of the policy process must be based on or informed by specific research and empirical evidence. The core of such evidence is, of course, data, including demographic, social, economic, and other relevant information if you're talking about policy on aging. This data is collected during quantitative and/or qualitative research, disaggregated as appropriate, including, of course, disaggregation by age, and analyzed to produce corresponding conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. Evidence is required at every stage of the policy process. Here it's presented in linear for the easy presentation discussion. The first stage of the policy process, the agenda setting, I repeat myself, which focuses on raising awareness and setting priorities. The tasks involve identifying new problems and opportunities and assessing their magnitude. The second stage, formulation, which involves setting goals, objectives, and measures or actions. Evidence is required at this stage for determining the policy options, selecting the preferred option or options, ensuring a comprehensive understanding of the specific situation and the required options to respond, providing instrumental links between a policy activity and an outcome and output, and assessing the cost and impact of an intervention, assessing before the policy starts, ex ante assessment as it's called. The implementation stage involves actual practical activities to achieve the goals and objectives of the policy. This stage requires operational evidence on the progress and obstacles of policy implementation. It includes analytic work related to the outcomes and outputs of the policy, systematic learning. This activity aims to identify effective approaches, understanding how they work, and recognize potential obstacles. Action research, that is policy action accompanied by critical reflection on this action. And pilot project data, which is often included also, particularly the initial stages of the policy implementation. The final stage, which is no less important, of course, is monitoring and evaluation. The perhaps stage is not the right term for this component or stage of the policy process, because elements of monitoring and evaluation ideally accompany the entire policy cycle. This stage envisages developing monitoring and evaluation mechanisms and elaborating indicators to reveal the outputs, outcomes, and gaps of the policy implementation. Next slide, please. The process of elaborating and utilizing evidence for policymaking involves several consecutive actions. Of course, first of all, policy needs to be collected, and it's a part of the development. Evidence is collected and analyzed. The next stage, it's translation and presentation. What is meant here? Translation involves formulating conclusions and recommendations which must be presented appropriately to policy experts and policy doers. Communication. The findings, conclusions, and recommendations must be communicated thoughtfully to end users, among them policymakers, again, policy experts, policy doers, and the general public, and the media. Ideally, such communication should be undertaken through an interactive, participatory approach ensuring reciprocity and adjustment. Next slide, please. There are certain key characteristics of good policy evidence. They look like absolutely evident. Good policy evidence needs to be accurate and objective. It correctly describes what is purposed to do. It must be credible and reliable, relying on a strong and clear line of argument, tried and tested analytical methods, and clear presentation of conclusions. It must be relevant, which means it is timely, topical, generalizable, and has policy implications. It must also be practical, in terms that it should be accessible to policymakers, easily translatable into policy, feasible, and affordable. And this characteristic, seem obvious. However, many of them are often overlooked, particularly as far as practical relevance are concerned. Next slide, please. To conclude this part of my presentation, I will summarize the main factors that may affect the evidence-based policymaking, including aging policies. These factors are listed on the slide. Let me briefly go through them. Weak economic conditions mean that resources for research and policy are scarce or not available at all. That happens, as we know. Difficult political environments. Political volatility tends to have a negative impact on the use of evidence in policy processes. Conditions of conflict. Wars or low-intensity conflicts limit the implication of evidence-based policy. Lack of accountability and participation of main stakeholders. Limited academic and media freedom and low civil society strength. Corruption, which leads to a lack of incentives and capacity to incorporate evidence and produce it for policy implementation. Predominance of populism and ignorance. Nothing new in this listing, and perhaps in your work you have faced some of them. Next slide, please. I will now turn to the policy on aging, and I will address a couple of related questions. First of all, why is there a policy on aging? Is it needed, and why? Secondly, what are the purpose and content of policy on aging? Next slide, please. Before reviewing policies on aging, it might be useful to establish some sort of a clear definition of the term, which is hardly possible. There are hundreds of aging theories and an equal number of definitions. But for today's conversation, I thought it would be important to distinguish between the two dimensions of aging without going into detail. These are individual and population aging. Individual aging refers to the biological and psychological changes that occur within a person's lifetime. Population aging, on the other hand, is a demographic phenomenon referring to an increasing median age as one of the indicators within the population. This is driven by factors such as lower fertility rates and increased life expectancy, and in some parts of the world there are also out-migration, resulting in a larger proportion of all the people within society. Next slide, please. Aging has become recognized at various international fora, including the United Nations, due to growing awareness of the scale and speed of demographic changes leading to population aging. We will focus on that dimension of aging. To reveal the significance of aging, we need to look at demographic indicators as we're talking about population aging. And this slide graphically presents 3 demographic indicators, clockwise from the top. The top chart shows the share of people age 60 plus in the world and in different world regions. And if you look on this chart, it is clear that the proportion of all the people is increasing in all regions of the world, as a result globally. The bottom right chart shows the absolute number of people age 60 plus in the world, that green columns, in more developed regions, blue columns, and in less developed regions, yellow columns. And it's seen immediately that population aging is primarily occurring in less developed regions, if you're talking about the scope. The final graph is on the bottom left. It shows the growth rate of the overall world population, that's orange segment declining, the growth rate of the population age 60 plus, that's light blue columns, and the growth rate of the population age 80 plus, the so-called old or oldest old, that dark blue segment. While the overall growth rate is declining, the population is still growing, but much slower. The growth rates of all the populations are much higher and increasing. And moreover, it's almost evident that the older the population group, the faster the increase. So the general conclusion is undeniable. Aging is growing. Next slide, please. Here is a quotation that highlights the importance of aging. During the Second World Assembly on Aging in 2002, the United Nations Secretary General, Kofi Annan at that time, stated, I quote, "Population aging is a universal force that has the power to shape the future as much as globalization." Well, back more than 20 years ago, globalization was not a dirty word. It is essential to recognize the ability of all the persons to contribute to society by taking the lead not only in their own betterment, but also in that of society as a whole. Forward thinking calls us to embrace the potential of the aging population as a basis for future development. Unquote. Next slide, please. These days, one can read and hear a lot about the challenges of aging, which are caused by the increasing absolute and relative number of older people. The most frequent cited challenges are, and they're summarized on the left part of this slide: sustainability of pension systems, labor force shortages, rising cost of health and social care for all the dependent people, negative image of aging and older people, ageism, discrimination, neglect, and abuse of members of society on the basis of age, most often older people. And these challenges are real and undeniable. However, there are also opportunities that remain largely unacknowledged and underutilized. Among them, and that's on the right side of the slide that are listed, growing healthy longevity, the basis for active and healthy aging, and increasing participation of older people in various spheres of societal life, including social, economic, cultural, and other spheres. Savings for retirement, which can be invested in economy and promote economic growth and social welfare. This opportunity is referred to as the so-called second demographic dividend. Knowledge and experience of older workers and volunteers, which makes them valuable participants in economic and social life, potential contribution of older people to economic and social production at the basis of the third demographic dividend. One more opportunity, development of silver economy, providing products and services for all the consumers, and thus stimulating, potentially, employment and economic growth. Next slide, please. However, none of these opportunities are self-sufficient or self-fulfilling. Policy measures are required to realize them, to turn the potential opportunities into real advantages. The political declaration, which was adopted by the Second World Assembly on Aging in Madrid, Spain in 2002, stated that policy on aging aims, and that's a quote on the screen, to respond to the opportunities and challenges of population aging in the 21st century and to promote the development of a society for all ages. Next slide, please. Now let us turn to international policy frameworks on aging which have been developed to establish this position. Next slide, please. The first significant attempt to develop an international policy framework on aging was made at the First World Assembly on Aging. This assembly, which was organized by the United Nations and the government of Austria, took place in Vienna, Austria in 1982, almost quarter centuries ago. The Vienna World Assembly was followed by several other significant events or milestones in the international action on aging. This includes the adoption of the United Nations by the United Nations of the United Nations Principles for Older Persons in 1991, and the preparations for and observances of the International Year of Older Persons in 1999. And 20 years after the First World Assembly on Aging, the Vienna Assembly, the second was held in Madrid, Spain, in 2002. Next slide, please. The main outcome of the First World Assembly on Aging, Christine, if possible, one slide back. Thank you. The main outcome of the First World Assembly on Aging, which was held again in Vienna, was the adoption of the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging. The Vienna Plan of Action contains important narratives and conceptual elaborations based on demographic, economic, and social data, and believe me, they're still worth reading. The core content of the Vienna Plan comprises 62 recommendations in areas of concern to aging individuals. They listed on this slide: health and nutrition, protection of elderly consumers, housing and environment, family, social welfare, income security and employment, and education. 1982. Next slide, please. Less than 10 years after the United Nations adopted the United Nations Principles for Older Persons in 1991, 18 principles organized in 5 clusters: independence, participation, care, self-fulfillment, and dignity. Principles have been playing a pivotal role in promoting the rights of older people and guiding the development of national policy responses to the needs and expectations of older people worldwide. From the Dominican Republic to Finland, at least these 2 countries acknowledge that they used the United Nations principles in developing their own national strategies on aging. Next slide, please. The next significant event in the history of international aging was the International Year of Older Persons, which was observed globally in 1999. The year's motto was "Towards a Society for All Ages." And this motto originated from the deliberation of the first 1995 World Summit for Social Development, which took place in Copenhagen, Denmark, and was held under the motto "Society for All." Society for All Ages was sort of an extension of this motto. The International Year was a global success, raising awareness of individual and population aging and paving the way for the Second World Assembly on Aging. Next slide, please. The second World Assembly on Aging took place in April 2002 in Madrid, Spain. It was organized and conducted by the United Nations in collaboration with the Spanish government. By the time of the decision of the United Nations to convene the Second World Assembly on Aging, the significance and power of population aging has become evident. In his address at the opening of the Assembly in Madrid, the United Nations Secretary General, that was again Kofi Annan, stated, I quote, and the quotation on the screen, "Aging is definitely no longer just a first world issue. What was a footnote in the 20th century is on its way to becoming a dominant theme in the 21st century." Next slide, please. The work of the Second World Assembly culminated in the adoption of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, with 3 priority directions for policy action. Older persons and development. Second, advancing health and well-being into old age, some sort of a traditional approach and policy on aging, and ensuring enabling and supportive environments. These days, the Madrid Plan of Action remains the main international policy document on aging that serves as a universal framework for national policy action on aging. The Madrid Plan of Action has been complemented and detailed by other international strategic frameworks. Next slide, please. The World Health Organization, WHO, has made central contributions to the development of international policy frameworks on aging. This slide illustrates just 2 of these frameworks. The concept and policy framework for active aging on the left side of the slide was developed by WHO in 2002 and served as a contribution to the Second World Assembly on Aging. In this policy framework, the active aging was defined as the process of optimizing opportunities for health, participation, and security in order to enhance quality of life as people age. More recently, the 2017 Global Strategy and Action Plan on Aging and Health of WHO laid the groundwork for the ongoing United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging. The Decade of Healthy Aging is aligned with the last 10 years of the Sustainable Development Goals. Several areas, to be precise, 4 areas for action are designated for the decade. Change how you think, feel, and act towards age and aging. The second one, ensure that communities foster the abilities of older people. The third one, deliver person-centered integrated care and primary health services responsive to older people and provide access to long-term care for older people who need it. All of these international policy frameworks incorporate extensive elaborations dedicated to scientific research and evidence-informed policy on aging. Even the 1982 Vienna Plan of Action, developed 43 years ago, contains thoughtful and useful narratives and proposals on this topic that remain valid today. However, the challenge has always been how to align aging research and policy making. Next slide, please. A key question is how research evidence is used in practice to inform policy making. There are 2 prevailing models for incorporating research into policy making: the knowledge-driven model and the problem-solving model. In the knowledge-driven model, policy experts consult available research findings to identify the most relevant solutions. To simplify, policy experts doing policy using the available knowledge which was produced by researchers. So researchers research, policy experts doing policy. The problem-solving model involves bringing together researchers and policy experts to work as a consortium to identify problems and opportunities and design solutions. In other words, they work together, the researchers and policy experts, throughout the entire policy-making process. Next slide, please. However, the links between research and policy-making are often declared but not functional, resulting in opinion-based policy-making prevailing instead of evidence or information-based policy-making. As Professor Sandra Nutley noted some 20 years ago, that's quotation on the screen, the interaction between policymakers and researchers is limited by the divergence of these two words. They use different languages, have different priorities, agendas, timescales, and reward systems. As a consequence, a communication gap often exists. 22 years ago, that formulation was put forward. On the screen is also a more recent remark on this topic. Scientists and policymakers have often different objectives, priorities, and timeliness, leading to potential conflicts and challenges. That formulation was put in the article by HOMeAGE and others. Next slide, please. The ongoing challenge lies in bridging the gap between policy and research. Research agendas can fulfill this role, including those in the field of aging. Next slide, please. It was during the Second World Assembly on Aging in Madrid that the policy priorities and objectives of an international policy framework, the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, were aligned with the research priorities on aging. This was achieved through the creation of the Research Agenda on Aging for the 20th century, a collaborative initiative between the United Nations Programme on Aging and the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics, IGG. The UN IGG Research Agenda was developed through a series of expert consultations held between 1999 and 2002. In April 2002, shortly before the beginning of the Second World Assembly on Aging, the Valencia Forum of Researchers and Practitioners on Aging endorsed the agenda. And this agenda was presented just a couple of days later at the Second World Assembly on Aging in Madrid. And both events, of course, took place in Spain and connected to each other. Next slide, please. The UN IGG Research Agenda was developed, quotation from the preamble of the Research Agenda, to support the implementation of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging and also to encourage researchers to pursue studies in policy-related areas where the findings may have practical and realistic applications for action on aging, unquote. Next slide, please. The research agenda identified 6 major research priorities. That's the central column of this slide. It also proposed 12 critical research areas. They're listed on the right part of this slide, the right column. And these major research priorities and critical research areas of the research agenda are related to the priority directions of the Madrid Plan of Action, which are presented in the left column. As a reminder, the first one, older persons and development. The second priority direction, advancing health and well-being into old age. And the third one, ensuring enabling and supportive environments. Next slide, please. The United Nations IGG project is not the only attempt to develop a research agenda linked to policy on aging. For instance, in 2001, an international panel on a research agenda and new data for an aging world develop a global research agenda. This agenda was not linked to a particular policy document, however. And this panel on a research agenda was convened by the United States National Academies and approved by the governing board of the United States National Research Council. The international panel identified 5 domains for cross-national research on aging. They're listed on the slide: work and retirement, savings and wealth, family structure and intergenerational transfers, health and disability, and well-being. Next slide, please. Another and more recent example of a research agenda is the strategic research agenda elaborated within the Joint Programming Initiative, More Years, Better Lives, that was done in 2014. More Years, Better Life is one of the 10 joint programming initiatives led by the European Union member states. This research agenda defines priorities for research and policy making in 4 domains of demographic impact on society: quality of life, health and well-being. The second one, economic and social production, governance and institutions, and sustainable welfare. It also identifies 11 research topics as priority issues to be addressed in the short and medium term. Next slide, please. And one of the most recent attempts to inform policy responses by supporting and activating the development of research agendas on aging and longevity is the book entitled A Research Agenda for Aging and Social Policy. This book was published last year in 2024. The agenda sets out 32 research questions which are grouped into 8 areas, and these 8 areas are presented on this slide. Area 1, population aging and social welfare policies, the life course perspective. Area 2, combating ageism. Area 3, strengthening the rights of older persons to reduce poverty and inequalities. Area 4, establishing new types of working and learning in digitalized societies. Area 5, transforming health, social, and long-term care systems. Area 6, enhancing social solidarity and intergenerational equity. 7th area, designing age-friendly environments and communities. And Area 8, strengthening international policy action on aging by involving all relevant stakeholders. The agenda's main conceptual approach is an evolution in research and policy, shifting the focus from population aging and individual late life issues to longevity. And this evolution involves relocating demographic transitions and the life course to the center of research and policy. Next slide, please. To conclude, I would like to share a quotation from the WHO World Report on Aging and Health of 2017, which highlights the importance of evidence-based policies for adapting to a changing and aging world. The report states, and quotation on the screen, "The world is entering an era in which evidence-informed policy on aging is not optional, but essential. Effective responses must be grounded in the best available data and research so that societies can adapt fairly and sustainably. Only by basing our actions on solid evidence can we create environments that enable all people to age with dignity, capability, and security." And the last slide, just to thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was wonderful and very comprehensive in everything you've covered here. So I really appreciate that, and you've also stayed to time largely. So we have about 10 to 14 minutes for some questions and some discussion. I guess just while we're waiting for those questions to come in, Alex, there's a couple of things. Actually, there's lots of things there that I was going to maybe probe a little bit more on. But one of the questions, I guess, in terms of the kind of models that you're describing around research and policymakers working together, so either that more applied model or that more collaborative piece, I guess one thing that struck me is the question about our policy capacities and policy capabilities and the ways in which research might feed into that. So if we're talking about policy capacity and its ability to be able to respond to demographic aging in the various different ways, and the policy capability might be more about the technical aptitude about what's actually happening with respect to the kind of the key goals or key focus that we should be looking at and how we might do that. To what extent do you think we've actually scaled up enough? And that's not to say that demographic aging is this massive challenge or anything else, but when we're looking at from a more critical perspective around these notions of structural lag, where infrastructures haven't adapted to the sort of ways in which our populations are changing, to what degree from the emergence of all those policy agendas that you talked about from your own experience, to what degree do we still have to scale up to really boost that capacity and to really boost that technical capability even within our policy infrastructure? And if so, then how might research feed an important part of that?
Thank you, Kieran. That's the central question, no doubts. When we're talking about policy capability, the immediate reference goes into the national capacity to address the issues of aging, opportunities and challenges. And this is very individual. The situation in different countries of the world, of course, different in terms of population aging. All the oldest countries of the world, such as my own Ukraine, one of the oldest country of the world, and much younger countries, like, for instance, your country, Ireland, which is younger than Ukraine, for instance, or the neighboring United Kingdom. Then politics is coming here. What has been invested, actually, into developing the infrastructure and allocating or relocating resources to address the issues related to aging. Very often, if once again repeating myself, if you look into the public media, which addresses the aging, 99%, I would dare to say, what we can read there is that aging is a threat. That started back to 1994 when the World Bank published its fundamental report avoiding the old age crisis. The content of that report was how to actually deal with the critical issues related to population aging. But the media picked up the very beginning of this report, crisis, and that was multiplied in so many publications. Opportunities have been sort of unrecognized and practically forgotten. We're talking usually about, when we're talking about demographic dividends, we just recalling the demographic dividend related to the youth bulge, the extensive number of younger people who can form the supply of the workforce of the countries. And it's countries which are at the initial stage of demographic transition. It's not applicable to Ireland or to Ukraine. That there are two other demographic dividends which are related to longevity, not to aging, but to longevity, and that's an important distinguish which has to be made. I mentioned them very briefly. The one is accumulated financial resources that's not universal, which can be reinvested in economy. That can work in more advanced countries of the European Union. It does not work in my country or neighboring countries of the former Soviet Union for a very simple reason, because pensions are miserable. But the said demographic dividend is universally applicable to any country of the world at the advanced stages of demographic transition. And that's the accumulated knowledge and experience of all the workers. But then the policy and politics have to come to help utilize this potential demographic dividend. None of these demographic dividends are working without appropriate policy and politics. Kieran, okay. I can continue, of course, but it's really the central issue in the policy of aging and policy of longevity.
Okay, and I can see a couple of questions coming in there. I'll come back to one just more generally about impacting policy, but Lucy.
Maybe going to the same direction. Thank you very much, Sasha. Once again, I was lovely to listen to, because it really it shows the path we are already quite some time on. But my very practical questions, and I hope to get from you very kind of practical answers. There are two on different levels. How can we, as researchers here in the room, can work with the political cycle? And because we just in Czech Republic changed the government as yesterday, and so I'm afraid we will have to start again with all the bargaining and showing how this is important, or I don't know. So if you have any practical tips how to go about this and how to involve research in that. And that's connecting in your, if you have experience, and can you suggest something how to, what really works into, as I put it down, in changing the opinion-based policies into at least informed ones. If you have any tips and tricks other than being a friend with those who are actually writing up the policies, but if there are any structured ways how to go about around it. Thank you.
I like to be a friend bit, Lucy.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, very provocative, I should say. So, but let me start with the first one. Have to move from opinion-based policy to evidence-based or evidence-informed policy. Let me, I won't be able now to quote exactly the presentation which was made by Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the neighboring country of the United Kingdom, back to early 80s. She was not Prime Minister at that time, and she explained why she did what she did. And she said something like that, I'm consulting the Old Testament to advance the policy of my country. That's perhaps the most prominent example of opinion-based policy. Does it mean that Margaret Thatcher was a low-level prime minister? I wouldn't dare to say so. But there were some experts which worked together with her, which helped to transform the conviction or opinion-based policy into evidence-based policy. We very often, and then I'm turning into practically the second question which you ask, what researchers can do to get engaged in the policy process. I believe the task here is to establish to clearly establish in the society the availability of knowledge which can be utilized for policy process. And you cannot do it without involving media. You have to establish friends in media who will be listening what you're saying and would convey the message to the general public. And through the general public, you can influence then the political process. The major challenge in any policy and politics is that the processes of policy implementation and the political processes do not coincide with each other. It's a very simple arithmetics. Usually the time or the length of political engagement does not exceed 4 or 5 years in the country. Then the government changes. Well, some governments, including my neighboring country, just managed to extend it to 6 or 7 years. But normally, once again, it's 4 to 5 years. The policy process is much longer. You cannot possibly expect the results in 4 or 5 years very often, right? So the politicians who sincerely want to make good change, they're trying to place the major reforms at the beginning of the political cycle. By the end of the political cycle, what was promised at the beginning are very often forgotten. So once again, the researchers, through their connections in media, can try to influence this process. You may ask me where it is done in good phase. I can think it practically in almost all members of the European Union, but I would mention the one specific state, which is small, and I used to work with for quite a few years. It's Malta, where the engagement of researchers from the University of Malta is very close. And there's also the United Nations Malta Institute on Aging, INEA, which is closely cooperates with the government on policy issues and training as well. Lucy, I understand that I couldn't possibly answer very specifically and precisely to these questions, but that's an ongoing thing, isn't it?
Thanks very much, Alexandra. And I'll just go to Pamela, and we might be running over by 2 or 3 minutes, but we will take that time. So, Pamela, please.
Thank you, Alexander, for your very thorough and excellent presentation. Kind of related to what Lucy was saying earlier, I perceive from the last publication of your agenda for research on aging that there is a transition towards an understanding of aging before from gerontology as a biomedical health or social problem to a more political problem. Am I okay in understanding that? Or am I wrong? If we want to, as researchers, to also try to focus on that understanding, how can we navigate it? Because it tends to be that gerontology doesn't want to politicize research. Anyways, thank you. That was the idea.
Thank you, Pamela. Well, yes, you're right. Your understanding is right. In many parts of the world, aging has become a political issue for good reason. If the proportion of all the people of retirement age exceeds, say, 20 or 30%, you cannot possibly ignore this. Then the policy issue becomes a political issue. And very often, if you follow the election processes in many countries, aging is, particularly in the European Union, aging is very often becomes one of the issues which is mentioned and forgotten in a few months after the government comes to power, the new government comes to power. Once again, because one of the most important things is forgotten. Aging, once again, is considered as a threat, as a challenge, and possible opportunities related to the second and third demographic dividends are forgotten. And that's where researchers can insist on understanding what it means. Ideally speaking, the governments which are genuinely interested in promoting the population policies, I would deliberately avoid mentioning demographic policies, they certainly would like to rely on the help and involvement of researchers, of academia. That happens in most of the European Union countries, but not universal. Pamela.
Okay. Thanks very much, Alexandra. And I'm going to ask if anybody has any last burning questions to raise your hand. But just while we're waiting for that to come in, Alexandra, can I just ask one final element from mine? And it's going back to maybe Lucy's element, question around impact. So I guess, you were talking about the power of the media there. for a group of researchers who are interested in putting out policy briefs or different kinds of briefs to communicate their findings and to be able to generate some sort of mobilization behind that, obviously with policymakers. But is it the media, or is it also advocacy and social movements that we should be looking to really be able to, if you like, champion the key kind of elements or key messages coming from these pieces? I suppose in the past, how have you found that, particularly in the multilateral system, because you were operating at a very high level? How has those kind of very grassroots activities, grassroots mobilizations, how have they worked, or have they worked in the context of your experience?
Kieran, no, absolutely relevant. Thank you for this question. Usually the recommendation are coming from intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations, for instance. But just referring back to my own experience in the United Nations Program on Aging, we worked closely with two entities. First of all, with the research communities, which helped us to formulate the policy recommendations on the sustainable and sufficient level. But we checked those formulations with the grassroots level organizations related to aging or older people. Involving them in discussions, involving them in the process of elaborating of the final recommendations. So it's happened, for instance, in the process of preparing for the second World Assembly on Aging, which took place in Madrid in 2002. The short group of experts, which was led by the United Nations Secretariat, with involvement of policy experts from different countries, both developed and developing. But then we also involved the representatives of the major non-government organizations, such as HelpAge International, International Federation on Aging, and some others, which discussed the proposals and helped us to formulate those which can be had by governments and at the grassroots level. Unfortunately, I have to say that all our attempts, and I'm referring now back to my years at the United Nations Program on Aging, all our efforts which we try to invest in establishing some sort of a ongoing communication for reformulation of the policy frameworks, for adjusting those policy frameworks, didn't work. The governments didn't pick it up. Very often what is discussed at the international fora, such as the United Nations, have not been implemented at the national level. It's a gap, Kieran, I have to say. And frankly, I don't see whether in the current circumstances, in the current environment of populism, we can expect that the research community would be playing much more significant role in formulating the policy.
Okay. Well, Alexandre, let's hope that that'll change at some point, but it is difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Poly crisis and so on. So look, what remains for me to say is just to say thanks very much to Alexandra for your contribution, for giving so much of your time and putting so much effort into capturing both the emergence of these kind of key issues and setting forward these kind of elements for the agenda as well going forward. So I really appreciate that, Alexander, on behalf of our network and on behalf of everybody here. And then just to wrap up the overall session today, thanks to everybody for joining and for contributing in to the various different sessions. So we look forward to welcoming you again, both in the in-person events that we'll be organizing in February, but we'll also have a public day as a part of that. So we'll let people know as the agendas and the key speakers during that point as well. So thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate your contribution and your attendance. Take care.
Kieran, thank you for this opportunity again. And thank you for your attention to everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.